On May 4th, 1471, in the mud and blood of Tewkesbury, a 17-year-old prince fell. Edward of Westminster, son of King Henry VI and Margaret of Anjou, became the only heir to the English throne ever slain in battle. Was he struck down amid the clash of swords, or executed before his enemies' eyes? His death did more than end a young life. It shattered a dynasty and tipped the balance of the Wars of the Roses forever. Edward of Westminster entered the world in October 1453 at Westminster Palace, under a sky already heavy with the storm of civil war. His birth should have been cause for celebration, the long-awaited male heir to King Henry VI and Margaret of Anjou. Instead, it coincided with the eruption of the Wars of the Roses, a brutal conflict between the houses of Lancaster and York. From the moment he took his first breath, Edward's life was shackled to war. His father, King Henry VI, was plagued by bouts of mental illness so severe that he often could not recognize those around him, let alone govern a kingdom. This left Margaret of Anjou, Edward's mother, to carry the weight of leadership. Fierce, ambitious, and unwavering, she fought to defend her son's birthright against the encroaching claims of the rival Yorkists. As a child, Edward was less a boy than a symbol. He was not simply the king's son, but the embodiment of Lancaster's hope. The crimson rose in a struggle against the white. Every lullaby, every whispered prayer over his cradle carried the echo of war drums in the distance. Servants, courtiers, and soldiers alike looked to him as the future, even as the kingdom crumbled around him. For Edward, there was no innocent childhood. The air he breathed was heavy with suspicion, betrayal, and the iron scent of blood. His earliest memories were not of play or discovery, but of whispered counsels and his mother's determined gaze, her voice sharpening like steel when she spoke of the Yorkist threat. Born into chaos, raised beneath the shadow of his father's illness and his mother's resolve, Edward was never afforded the simple gift of being just a child. He was a prince forged by conflict, destined to walk a path already lined with blades. His very existence was both a blessing to his mother's cause and a curse that drew the enemy's eye. From the cradle, Edward of Westminster was not merely a boy. He was Lancaster's heir, Lancaster's hope, and Lancaster's inevitable sacrifice. Edward's life quickly became a life on the move, a journey not of choice, but of survival. With Yorkist power rising, Margaret of Anjou fled with her young son, crossing the Channel to France in search of allies. The boy prince, scarcely old enough to understand the words spoken around him, was thrust into exile. In the courts of France, Edward was paraded not as a child in need of safety, but as a living banner. He was presented to kings, dukes, and nobles as the rightful heir to England, a boy whose crown had been stolen before it ever touched his brow. Behind every smile, behind every hand extended in greeting, there was calculation. To support Edward was to challenge the power of the Yorkists. To ignore him was to concede Lancaster's dream was fading. Edward grew up absorbing the weight of these expectations. His tutors taught him not only letters and Latin, but the stories of Lancaster's glory, the duty he carried in his blood. Where another child might have been shielded from such burdens, Edward was pushed toward them. He learned of loyalty and treachery, of armies raised and armies crushed, before he ever learned the joy of an untroubled day. For the Yorkists, Edward's very existence was intolerable. He was a living threat, the embodiment of a rival claim, a spark that could reignite war at any moment. Rumors spread, pamphlets whispered of him as dangerous, a wolf's cub who would devour peace if allowed to grow. Thus Edward's youth was marked not by play, but by preparation. He was molded in exile to reclaim a crown he had never worn. his identity fused with Lancaster's cause. To his mother, to his followers, he was more than her child. He was the promise of restoration. To his enemies, he was the shadow of endless bloodshed. From childhood, Edward of Westminster was not free to be himself. He was Lancaster incarnate, a boy hunted across seas, raised in exile, bound to a destiny carved in steel. Contemporary accounts paint a troubling picture of Edward's temperament. Yorkist chroniclers described him as bloodthirsty, a boy who delighted in tales of battle and sought vengeance as if it were sport. Whether these reports were true or deliberate propaganda is uncertain. Yet the image of a cruel and vengeful prince stuck to him like armor he could never remove. Such character sketches served political purposes. To the Yorkists, Edward needed to be portrayed not only as a military threat, but as morally unfit to rule. By branding him as vicious and merciless, they justified their own campaigns against him and framed the Lancastrian cause as one of danger and instability. Still, even Lancaster's allies noted Edward's seriousness, his precocious obsession with matters of war and justice. In an age where kingship was often secured by the sword, perhaps this was inevitable. His education emphasized chivalry, honor, and military strategy, embedding in him the idea that his entire existence was oriented toward battle. Yet what might have been a child's natural eagerness to impress became twisted in the telling. A prince rehearsing tales of knights and victories became, in the words of his enemies, a tyrant in waiting. A boy demanding loyalty was recast as a cruel dictator before he had the chance to wear a crown. Edward's temperament, whether sharpened by circumstance or exaggerated by propaganda, reveals the cruel paradox of his life. He was not judged for who he truly was, but for what others feared he might become. To his mother, he was a prince of destiny. To his supporters, he was the hope of Lancaster. To the Yorkists, he was the harbinger of endless war. The real Edward of Westminster remains elusive, a teenager wrapped in rumor, political distortion, and the burden of inheritance. Whatever his true character, the world refused to see him as a boy. He was, instead, a cipher, a canvas onto which both friend and foe projected their fears, ambitions, and nightmares. In 1470, Edward's fate intertwined with that of Anne Neville, daughter of Richard Neville, the powerful Earl of Warwick, known to history as the Kingmaker. This marriage was not born of youthful affection, but of political necessity, a binding of two dynasties at a time when the Wars of the Roses raged with brutal intensity. By wedding Anne, Edward secured Warwick's allegiance to the Lancastrian cause. For Margaret of Anjou, the match was a triumph. The Kingmaker's power could tilt the scales of war. For Warwick, it was an opportunity to secure influence at the heart of the Lancastrian royal family. For Edward himself, it was yet another reminder that his life was less his own and more a tool of strategy. The union, however, was brief and haunted by tragedy. Within a year, the tides of war shifted again. Edward would be slain at Tewkesbury, leaving Anne a widow at only 15. Her fate spiraled into another political entanglement when she married Richard, Duke of Gloucester, the future Richard III. This cruel twist of history entwined Anne's destiny with two of England's most tragic figures. One husband slain as the only prince ever killed in battle. The other, a king doomed to fall at Bosworth Field. Anne herself would die young, her life marked by the same relentless brutality that defined Edward's. The marriage between Edward and Anne, though politically significant, produced no heirs, no legacy to soften the blow of his death. Instead, it became a ghostly fragment of history, a reminder of how quickly alliances shifted and how mercilessly war consumed even the youngest lives. For Edward, his marriage to Anne Neville was not the beginning of a dynasty, but the prelude to an ending. For Anne, it was the first act in a life of loss, betrayal, and sorrow. Together, they symbolize how the Wars of the Roses devoured not only crowns and thrones, but the personal bonds of those caught in its unforgiving tide. The morning of May 4th, 1471, dawned over the fields of Tewkesbury, heavy with fog and dread. Two armies stood poised to decide the fate of England. The Yorkists, under Edward IV, hardened by years of war, and the Lancastrians, desperate and fractured, led in part by the 17-year-old Prince Edward of Westminster. For Edward, this was more than a battle. It was the proving ground of his birthright. Reports say he rode at the head of his division, his youthful frame armored, his expression fierce with determination. To his mother, Margaret of Anjou, watching from the rear, it was a moment of both pride and terror. Her only son, Lancaster's last hope, charging toward destiny. The clash was brutal. Arrows darkened the sky, pikes splintered, and swords sang their iron hymn. For hours, the two sides tore at each other across hedges, ditches, and open ground. Yet discipline and experience favored the Yorkists. Slowly but inexorably, the Lancastrian lines crumbled. Edward fought amid the chaos, but youth and bravery could not compensate for numbers and strategy. His division was overwhelmed, driven back into the Abbey meadows, where the slaughter became merciless. Margaret's forces, already exhausted, broke apart, their banners trampled into the mud. As the sun set on Tewkesbury, the Lancastrians lay defeated, their dreams shattered. For Edward, the prince who had been raised to reclaim a crown, there would be no glory, only capture, only death. The battlefield of Tewkesbury was not merely the scene of defeat. It was the stage for the extinction of Lancaster's direct line. The death of Edward of Westminster remains one of the most haunting enigmas of the Wars of the Roses. Chroniclers disagree, and each version casts a different shadow over his final moments. Some accounts describe Edward dying as a soldier, cut down in the thick of battle. According to this version, he fell bravely amid the carnage, struck by the blades of Yorkist knights. It is the image of a prince who never surrendered, who perished in the fury of combat before he had the chance to become a man. But others whisper of darker, more chilling circumstances. They claim Edward was captured alive, dragged before Edward IV himself after the battle. In this telling, the young prince stood trembling yet defiant, confronted by his victorious rival. Words were exchanged. Edward reportedly declared his intent to avenge his father's deposition. And with that, the Yorkist king ordered his death. He was struck down on the spot, executed like a common prisoner rather than honored as a prince. Which story is true? Historians remain divided. The first paints him as a fallen warrior, the second as a humiliated captive. Both, however, underline the same brutal truth. At 17, Edward of Westminster's life was extinguished violently, without mercy, without future. His death marked more than the end of a boy's life. It was the end of a dynasty. The crimson rose of Lancaster was trampled into the mud at Tewkesbury, and with it, the last hope of Margaret of Anjou. Whether slain in battle or executed in cold blood, Edward's end was a message to all who opposed York. No heir, no matter how young, was safe. The death of Edward of Westminster was more than the loss of a single life. It was the collapse of a dynasty. With the prince slain at Tewkesbury, the direct male line of the House of Lancaster came to an abrupt and brutal end. there would be no King Edward IV of Lancaster, no continuation of Henry VI's legacy. The crimson rose withered on the battlefield that day. Margaret of Anjou, the indomitable queen who had fought for decades to protect her son's inheritance, was captured shortly after the battle. She, who had been the living embodiment of resistance, now stood broken. For years she had endured exile, intrigue, and betrayal, carrying her son like a banner through every trial. Now her banner lay in the mud, and her son was gone. She was taken prisoner, her defiance hollow in the shadow of such loss. The Yorkists emerged triumphant. Edward IV's position was stronger than ever, his enemies silenced not just by victory, but by annihilation. The capture and eventual death of Henry VI, murdered in the Tower of London within weeks, ensured that Lancaster had no immediate heir, no rallying point for rebellion. The political consequences were devastating. What had once been a dynastic struggle between two royal houses became, after Tewkesbury, a dominance of one. The Yorkist sun rose higher, casting a long shadow across England. Yet the cost of such victory was heavy in blood. The extinction of Lancaster's heir did not bring peace, but left England scarred, its people weary of endless war. In the death of Edward of Westminster, England had not found closure, only silence, the fragile calm before another storm. Edward of Westminster occupies a unique place in English history, the only Prince of Wales ever to die in battle. His death was not just a personal tragedy, but a symbol of the merciless nature of the Wars of the Roses. In him, the hopes of a dynasty were extinguished, and with his fall, the course of England's monarchy shifted irrevocably. To Yorkist chroniclers, Edward's end was poetic justice, the rightful fate of a boy who embodied Lancaster's aggression. To later generations, however, his fate became a cautionary tale, a reminder that even princes, with crowns within reach, could be ground into dust by the wheels of power. His widow, Anne Neville, carried his ghost into her second marriage with Richard III, a man whose own reign would collapse in blood at Bosworth. Through Anne, Edward's story lingered in the fabric of England's monarchy, a haunting echo of promises broken and futures stolen. Edward's death also magnified Margaret of Anjou's tragedy. Once a queen, once a mother, who dreamed of securing her son's throne, she spent her final years in exile, stripped of both power and hope. The boy for whom she had fought, plotted, and suffered was gone, leaving her life hollowed by grief. The legacy of Edward of Westminster is one of absence. He never ruled, never shaped policy, never had the chance to become the man history might have judged. His life was reduced to a symbol: the prince who died at 17, the heir who never ascended, the child whose death signaled the triumph of York, but also the curse of endless instability. Edward's short existence reminds us that the Wars of the Roses were not only battles of kings and nobles, but crucibles that consumed children, mothers, and futures. His legacy is not one of power, but of loss. The kind of loss that leaves scars long after crowns have changed hands. In the wake of Tewkesbury, the story of Edward of Westminster did not simply vanish. Its shadows lingered in the lives of those closest to him, shaping their fates with quiet devastation. Anne Neville, his young widow, became one of history's most tragic figures. Barely 15 when Edward died, she was left unmoored, a girl caught in the ruthless machinery of dynastic politics. Within 2 years, she married Richard, Duke of Gloucester, the man who would become Richard III. Her life, marked first by the violent loss of her husband, then by the turbulence of her second marriage, ended in frailty and sorrow. She died in 1485, childless and broken, just months before her second husband fell at Bosworth. In Anne's brief life, the ghost of Edward seemed never to loosen its grip. Margaret of Anjou, Edward's mother, bore a grief too heavy for words. Captured after Tewkesbury and imprisoned in England, she was eventually ransomed back to France. But she returned not as a queen, nor as the fiery leader who had once defied kings, but as a defeated widow, stripped of purpose. Her son gone, her husband dead, her cause extinguished, she lived her final years in obscurity, dying in 1482 in Anjou, far from the land she had once fought so desperately to rule. For the Yorkists, Edward's death had been a triumph, but the Wars of the Roses were far from over. Richard III's downfall and the rise of the Tudors proved that Lancaster's shadow had not disappeared. Edward's memory, the boy slain before his time, remained an unhealed wound, a symbol of how fragile power truly was. Thus, even in death, Edward of Westminster haunted England. His absence became a presence, a reminder of how blood and ambition consumed not just thrones, but families. Edward of Westminster was never crowned, never ruled, and never had the chance to grow into the man history might have known. His destiny was written the moment he was born into a fractured kingdom, to serve as a banner for Lancaster and to die for a crown he would never wear. At 17, his story ended not with triumph, but with obliteration. His name became a footnote in chronicles, overshadowed by the kings who survived him. Yet in that footnote lies a truth more piercing than any sword, that even heirs apparent can be nothing more than sacrifices in the theater of power. Edward's life is a reminder that the Wars of the Roses were not simply about politics or ambition. They were about families torn apart, children thrust into roles they could not escape, and destinies decided by forces far beyond individual control. His short existence illustrates the cruelty of a system where lineage was both a blessing and a curse, a gift of privilege that, in his case, became a death sentence. In the mud of Tewkesbury, the blood of a 17-year-old heir mingled with that of soldiers and nobles, erasing the line between prince and common man. Death did not distinguish between them. Edward of Westminster's fate reminds us that history is not only shaped by victors, but scarred by the silence of those who fell too soon. His was a life marked not by achievements, but by the inevitability of sacrifice. And so, his story endures, not as that of a king, but as a boy whose destiny was written in blood before he ever had the chance to choose his path.